Good evening and welcome to this public lecture series. I can see quite a few of you who are joining us at the moment. My name's Verity. I actually work for the University of Wolverhampton's Regional Learning Centre based in Stafford, and I've just popped in to say hi tonight and welcome you this evening. I'm going to leave you obviously in the capable hands of Shirley Steer, who works for University Centre Telford, and obviously Dr. Daisy Black, who's going to deliver our lecture this evening. But while we just welcome you in, I know it's a lovely sunny evening, so if you are joining us this evening, you'd be glad to know that we can't see you even though you can see us. So if you want to go and grab a glass of wine, grab a cup of tea, glass of water, and you want to sit in the garden and listen to Daisy this evening, you are more than welcome to. But without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Shirley Steer. Shirley is responsible for this evening's lecture along with Daisy, and Shirley is part of the team at the University Centre Telford.
We're delighted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture with Dr. Daisy Black, using politeness to resist medieval courtly love and other forms of sexual harassment. We are delighted to welcome Daisy for her first public lecture with us. This lecture is the second in a series of humanities public lectures this year. My name is Shirley Steer and I'm the facilitator of University Centre Telford. We are part of the University of Wolverhampton and are based in the heart of Telford in Shropshire. We hold our public lecture program both in our centre in Telford or online. Before I introduce Daisy and hand over to her, I just wanted to explain that there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the lecture via the Q&A button. If you are using a laptop or desktop, the icon is on the bottom of your screen in the middle. If you are using a mobile, it will be in the top right-hand corner. The lecture is being recorded, so please can I ask you not to share any personal information in the Q&A. Daisy Black is a lecturer in English literature at the University of Wolverhampton. She has been at the university since 2017. She specializes in medieval religious drama with a particular interest in time and gender. She also works as a theatre director and a storyteller and writes short stories and plays, and is one of the 2018 BBC AHRC New Generation Thinkers. Welcome, Daisy.
Thank you so much, and especially thank you for organising me and sorting me out to give this lecture.
You're welcome.
In the chat, I have put a document with translations of some of the things that I couldn't fit on the PowerPoint. So most of the time I'll give translations for the medieval text, but that's just in case I couldn't fit them on, or it would have looked really, really unaesthetically pleasing. I'll just share my screen with you. Good. Obviously, as you'll probably guess from the title of this, trigger warnings, I'm going to be talking quite a lot about sexual harassments and coercion and manipulation as well in this lecture, and I'll be obviously looking at it in a medieval context, but there are modern resonances as well, which I hope will become clear as we go throughout. Someone is trying to flirt with you. They're invading your personal space. If you walk off, they might follow you. If you say you're not interested, they might shout at you, or worse. So you're as polite as possible, flawlessly, achingly polite. Tea with the Queen, polite. Your grandma would be proud, polite, until you can get away. Once away, you feel sick, relieved, sweary effing furious because your grandma had to do this too. The use of politeness as a line of defence against harassment has been much discussed in modern media and in feminist discourse. But this isn't a new strategy. A similar use of politeness also appears across a variety of medieval texts, where it's employed by female and male characters to manage unwanted or inappropriate advances. In the late 13th century poem Dame Siriþ, Margery uses politeness to gain control of her space, while her suitor tries to use that very politeness against her. In the early 16th century Digby Mary Magdalen play, the saint combines directness and polite address as she tries to rebuff a local playboy in a pub. Most famously, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Gawain uses politeness to negotiate the advances of a lady who physically and verbally harasses him. The context, forms, class structures, and outcomes of all of these are very different. Politeness has a different meaning in medieval romance to in semi-dramatic comic narrative or in performance. And in performance, tone, expression, and gesture can very much dictate how meaning is formed between player and audience. The examples I've just mentioned also have big class differences. Gawain comes from an idealized courtly aristocratic background. Digby's Mary Magdalen is from a castle-owning landed gentry, and Dame Margery comes from a merchant family that we would today call middle class, a family that pays scrupulous attention to the behaviour and conduct of the aristocratic classes. But all three of these texts parody the concept of courtly love by staging situations in which the suitor is either inappropriate, ungenuine, or untrustworthy. And all three of them show their protagonists using politeness as a defensive mechanism to resist them. The language of courtly wooing performed many functions. It was used for social cohesion, it was used to bolster power structures, it was used to play with those structures, it was used for bonding between men and women, and it was also used for self-expression by both men and women. Courtly love language in particular was a form of heavily stylized art or artifice. But when unreciprocated, or when it makes the object of love uncomfortable, courtly love becomes a language of sexual coercion. Margery Corrie Woods, Carissa Harris, Misty Urban, and David Grubbs have all persuasively demonstrated the crossovers between languages of love, seduction, coercion, and rape in medieval texts. And these are just some of the very recent publications in this area, and we're looking out for some new ones as well. There are a few more volumes that people are working on. But this means that, if we take that as default, that courtly love is a language of coercion to some extent, this means that every response which doesn't enthusiastically consent to being wooed might be read as a strategy for survival or deflection. In order to counteract the artificiality of courtly love language, it's not surprising that acts resisting it require a similarly creative, performance-based response. And today I want to explore these three examples with you, which use evasive politeness as a performance of defense through which the person being harassed exercises their agency and resistance. I want to look at how politeness works and what it might cost to those using it. These examples show fictional characters using politeness to achieve a specific outcome, whether it's to escape, de-escalate, or downplay a situation, or to manage it by preventing it becoming worse. So my first text, Dame Siriþ. In this 13th century poem, merchant's wife Margery turns down the clerk Willikin's generous proposal of sex. He turns to local wise woman Dame Siriþ for help, who eventually agrees to play a trick on Margery. Feeding her dog mustard to make it cry, Dame Siriþ pretends to be a poor woman. When Margery offers her charity, Dame Siriþ spins her a yarn about the crying dog being her daughter, who has been magically transformed by a clerk's witchcraft because she spurned his sexual advances. Margery is terrified of the same fate. She sends for Willikin immediately. Perhaps because of an ongoing desire to read Dame Siriþ as the earliest surviving fablio, fablios are short comic stories in English, approaches to this story have tended to read Margery and Willikin's dialogue in the same way as the ridiculous trick that follows it. And here's an example of it here. She seems to invite Willikin into what's called love talking, a kind of stylized flirtation. While several people have paid attention to Margery's courtly language, the pair's dialogue is most often read as comical, with humour arising, as von Kreisler has summarised, in the clash between the language of love and its natural opposite, conjugal love. I'm very suspicious, however, of the word love to describe the poem that is so curiously loveless. While sexually tricky is very common in medieval European stories, As we'll see, this is an example where the wooed woman makes it very plain that she refuses to consent to Willikin's proposal. The poem's contest comes not just from a clash of ideals of courtly versus conjugal love, but from Margery's use of courtesy to try and control their situation. Sorry, I seem to have got the slides mixed up here. There we go. This is Margery's opening speech, and it positions her as a generous hostess welcoming Willikin into her house. "Welcome, so I ever feel joy," said this wife. "If it is your will, come and sit and let me know what is your will, my dear life. By our Lord Heaven's King, if I may do anything that is dear to you, you might find me fully generous. For happily will I do it for you without grief." Gabriel Ford's insightful analysis reads Margery's welcome as class-based fictional postures. It distinguishes her social reality from a performed persona. That is, this is the wife of a merchant, but she's adopting the kind of hospitality, flowery language ideas of the medieval nobility. This kind of aspiration to a class higher than your own is something that's often punished in the fabliaux genre. This sort of aspiring tends to lead to thwarting, humiliation, or even, as happens in Chaucer's Reeve's tale, assault. Rather disturbingly, however, several modern scholars, Ford included, have extended this to argue that Margery's polite, courteous, pseudo-aristocratic speech is consent to wooing. But even posh politeness isn't consent. If Margery's lines are a deliberate performance, their effect on their intended audiences comes into question. On first glance, these lines introduce Margery as a middle-ranking woman with courtly aspiration. And such women, as I've said, have that aspiration exploited for sexual ends across the wider fabliaux genre. These readers, however, already know of Willikin's less than chivalrous intent because it's told to us at the beginning of the poem. We know that Margery is married, and we know that he is so madly in love with her, he thinks he's going to die. This means that Margery's courteous statements, "If I may do anything that's pleasing to you, you may find me full generous," is ironic for the audience because we have that foreknowledge. We know what is pleasurable to him. The audience then can already anticipate how Willikin's going to exploit Margery's offer of free generosity, especially because free at the time also had a sexual sense. It meant kind of sexually licentious or generous as well. But even in this context, Margery's words are still not an amorous invitation. Thomas Honeger notes that other medieval authors show female characters explicitly denying the assumption that welcoming speech or friendly behaviour constitutes consent to being wooed. Politeness was also a strategy advised by the kinds of medieval conduct literature Carissa M. Harris has argued stages mothers teaching their daughters strategies for avoiding rape. One example of this is how the good wife taught her daughter, which I have just put up here. And this conduct literature stresses the importance of women making a courteous answer to men's courtship. This kind of courtesy in the poem is also advocated when a man approaches you randomly on the street, and it says, "Acquaint you not with every man that you meet then in the street. Although he would be acquainted with you, greet him courteously and let him be." This advice will be chillingly familiar to any of us who've experienced street harassment. The demand to be polite in the hope the situation won't escalate and you can leave safely. The costs of not doing this, as this fantastic webcomic by Dina Mohammed shows, can be very high. While Dame Siriþ, Margery and Willikin do seem to be acquainted, we can also see a similar process of cautious, courteous navigation at work in Margery's welcoming speech. If this speech's primary audience is with Willikin, then Margery is using it to preemptively manage his behaviour. Modelling the language and behaviour of an idealised aristocratic class, Margery hopes to get Willikin to follow those standards of behaviour. This is a form of self-protection. As Harris and others have shown, lower class women in pastoral and fabliaux literature are particularly vulnerable to sexual assault, thinly and often not even thinly disguised as love from more socially privileged assailants. There's a manuscript image of something like that going on here. While Margery is of the merchant class, she amplifies her status by performing the language of the class above her, a class that would not have had to accept harassment in this manner, who do not appear as victims in fablio, and who were more likely to have had the resources and power to police, defend, and demand reparation for any sexual assault. Acting the role of courtly aristocrat, Margery lays claim to deserve being treated with the equivalent respect. Moreover, her evocation, "By our Lord, Heaven's King, if I may do anything that is pleasing for you," adds religious weight to this performance of moral and social value. These same words appear again in her later denial of Willikin, when she says, "That would I do for nothing by our Lord Heaven's King that is above." This exasperated verbatim repetition of Lord Heaven's King makes it clear Margery's open speech set a standard of behaviour, and Willikin has failed to uphold it. As well as setting an expected standard of conversation, Margery's speech also directs Willikin's physical presence. Willikin instigates the action in the stanza preceding this. He enters Margery's space. He speaks first. He is entirely in control of that situation. At this point, however, Margery makes a polite invitation. "If it is thy will, come and sit." This takes control by physically organising Willikin's body within her space. While an invitation to sit might be read as a convivial intimacy, as something polite, it also restricts Willikin to a chair, making it harder for him to suddenly approach Margery and easier for her to make a distance between them than she is enough distance to be comfortable with. Cleverly, she frames this in a way which makes it appear Willikin has a choice to sit, if it is your will, but refusing to sit after this polite invitation would seem churlish, and he wants to get her on his side. Her speech, therefore, establishes conversational and physical spaces that she needs to feel safe during this encounter. The immediate effect of this is to wrong-foot Willikin. He has come with a proposal that doesn't fit the codes Margery's established. He therefore attempts to use Margery's own courtesy to trap her, first of all asking her to promise to not be angry at what he's going to ask. Indeed, Margery seems to be digging a bigger hole for herself, because she says, "Uncourteous I will never be, nor could I, for anything that I have learnt." However, such is the strength of her opening courteous performance that even her claims she won't take exception to his request merely raise the standards for Willikin's behaviour. When we finally hear it, Willikin's proposal can be, it's very, very long, but it can be summarised as, "I've loved you for years and years and years, even though I've not really been around much. Since your husband's out, I'll love you secretly. I'm very discreet." It's literally what he's saying here. It's incongruous and it's inappropriate given their conversations so far. Willikin's proposal is a trashy, spectacular failure of Margery's standards. This uncourteous request allows her to easily refuse his demands without compromising her own promise to not get angry. It allows her to refuse the proposal by calling him out on his failure to perform, emphasising her own flawless performance of love and conjugal duty at the same time. And here she says, "I have my lord as is my spouse, that as a maiden brought me to his house with honour enough. He loves me and I him well. Our love is as true as steel, without sorrow. Although he be away from home on his business, I will be unhappy if I learn to be a whore. That shall never be. I shall never do such falsity on bed nor on floor." Interestingly specific about where she does not want to be a whore in this version. Margery's declaration of love for her husband is the only convincing statement of love in this poem, and it contrasts sharply with the language she now directs to Willikin. His uncourteous request allows her to drop her own politeness. She calls the proposal out for what it is. "I would be unhappy if I learned to be a whore." Her use of the word whore here confronts the fact that the social and moral cost of sex would be very different for each of them. It flattens Willikin's attempt to pass off his proposal as courtly love. Willikin tries to turn the situation back against her. He scrambles to retrieve some of their earlier courteous register of speech. And here he says, "Dame, dame, turn your mood. Your courtesy was ever good, and yet shall be. For the Lord that made us, amend your mood, and turn your mind, and have pity on me." There's a implicit threat here to Margery's reputation. He seems to be suggesting her courtesy is marred if she denies Willikin having promised to withhold her anger, Your courtesy was ever good and yet shall be. The threat in and yet is quite clear here, I think. He tries to argue that her current mood is incompatible with courtesy, and the way to restore this is to have pity on him. But his performance is flawed, it can't be resumed. Margery's blunt reply, "Oldest thou me a fool, do you think me a fool?" refuses to allow Willikin to redefine the meaning of courtesy, while simultaneously denying him the politeness she's used before the proposal. Yes, Margery is later tricked into capitulating by the rather more cunning Dame Siriþ. And Dame Siriþ manipulates her principles of courtesy by using her welcome to gain her trust. But in terms of Willikin, Margery's use of politeness to expect and then defend her right to courtesy does at least temporarily succeed. Willikin retreats from his space. In comparison, the Digby manuscript's play Mary Magdalen contains a similarly striking moment where a female character confronts a suitor for being uncivil. This is a huge and deeply eccentric play, and it charts largely the fall and redemption of a saint who is widely seen as sexually promiscuous in medieval hagiographies. In the episode covering Mary's fall, we first see her seduced from her castle by the amiable tongue of Lady Lectury. Luxuria and Mary use a courtly register together, which is very similar adopted by that of Margery and Dame Siriþ. In this class, however, Mary really is an aristocrat rather than a merchant class woman aspiring to be one. This use of language makes the two characters appear in harmony with one another. Here you've got Lectury saying, "I intend to be your servant," and Mary says, "Your debonair obedience seduces me to tranquility, not since you desire it in every way. I have great pleasure to receive you. You are heartily welcome to me. Your tongue is so amiable and rationally arranged." Lectury says, "Now, good lady, will you tell me why no happiness remains with you?" Mary says, "For my father, I have great heaviness. When I remember his death, my mind grows deadened." And Luxury replies, "Ah, lady, be of good comfort, for such abuses may breed much disease. Take pains to put aside such disappointments. Commit yourself to sports which best please you." While Lectury's first address does employ flattery, her Latinate dialogue also stresses the proper conceits of a courtly lover's servitude. Where Willikin's wooing is all about himself, his desire, his request, and when he's caught out, his own reputation, Lectury inquires after Mary's emotional state. She ostensibly seeks to serve and console, but she doesn't demand anything from Mary. And here, interestingly, we have a female coded character, albeit a one representing a vice Lectury, wooing successfully a female figure. And another paper I want to write one day is how this kind of provides the ground for some of the early modern plays in which women prove far better wooers of women than men do of women, especially when they're using courtly love language. Lectury's suit is therefore effective, and Mary leaves her castle. Joanne Findon and Teresa Coletti argues that this play gives Mary a motive for her fall. She's grieving for her father and she's more vulnerable. Moreover, Coletti suggests Mary is vulnerable because she, as a rich woman expected to advance her family's standing through marriage, has already been framed as an object of courtly desire by her father. Findon and Coletti both assume Mary is equally easily seduced by the gallant curiosity, however, a male figure who she meets in a tavern. However, if we take a closer look at this theme, it seems to suggest that while Mary openly admits she is, quote, ravished by Lady Lectury, the male gallant curiosity has a far tougher time of it. Rather than being Findon's attractive and smooth-talking young man, the gallant is not young. In fact, he shaves to seem young, and he proves even less suited to courtly conversation than Dame Siriþ Clark. There's something highly artificial about the Digby gallant, and like Willikin, he woos a woman he is ill-equipped to speak to. And given the ridiculous nature of this speech, I'm going to have to wear a fake moustache to perform it. Hoff, 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 a fresh new gallant. Beware of thirst, set down that drink. What, you think, sirs, that I were a merchant because I am newly come to town? With some pretty barmaid would I speak to in private. I have a shirt of Wren's linen with pennant sleeves, and a lace of silk from my Lady Constance. Ah, how she is beautiful and resplendent. When I'm away from her presence, Lord, how I sigh. I will advise sovereigns and distant subjects. In winter, I wear a waistcoat. In summer, none at all. My doublet and my hose always match perfectly. Before evening, I will seem shaven to seem young. And with hair against hair, I love to play very much. This makes me elegant and amorous in desire. Thus live I in the world, I do it for no pride. The gallant is not like the other men in this play. He's a parody. He's a parody of the man about town who wears courtly love as insincerely as he does his fashionable tight matching clothing. And he almost seems to anticipate the comic gender performance of a modern drag king. There is nothing about this character that is not artificial and mocking the type of man that it's supposed to be based on. The gallant's character, therefore, satirizes both the performance of courtly love and the kind of men who subscribe to it, especially given the scene is performed in a lower class tavern. Where Willikin attempts to mimic and then exploit Margery's politeness, the gallant goes straight in there with a sexualized compliment that jars with Mary's own courteous language. Here we've got him saying, dear Duchess, my daisy, splendid of colour, most of femininity, your sovereign colours sent with sinistry. Consider my love unto you all, or else I am smart with the pains of perplexity. Mary's never met this guy before, unlike Margery and Willikin, who've clearly got some prior knowledge of each other. And she reacts indignantly to this bizarre and sudden declaration of love, with almost the same words that Margery used as well. Why, sir, ween you that I were a kell? Why, sir, do you think I were a whore? Puncturing her suitor's florid praise, Mary calls out the transgressive nature of his request, with a bit of irony as well, because she's got a reputation as a prostitute saint, but this is the moment before she falls. Compared with Mary's enthusiastic but courteous responses to lechery, which are praise, involve praise that aren't sexualized in the same way, her replies to the gallant are blunt, suggesting a desire to shut down the conversation immediately and mistrusting his talk as ridiculous. And so she suspiciously asks him, what caused you that you love me so suddenly? And for what reason do you love me so suddenly? But there's still a sense here that Mary's using politeness to try and control the situation. Despite the gallant's rude behaviour, Mary still addresses him as Sir, an honorific that diffuses any potential for offence at her responses. And it communicates her own genteel status and demands the gallant lives up to the title she's given him. While the gallant is undeterred, asking pardon, but still playing she would feel his love, Mary reproves his claims that he can't refrain from loving her. She gives him a lesson in manners towards the end of this quotation, clearly expressing that she expects good behaviour from him. Sir, courtesy should teach you to be restrained. The gallant's admission, you know a lot about nurture, good breeding, acknowledges that her statement has emphasised the class difference between them. While not as adept at Margery at using courtesy to control the situation, Mary nevertheless succeeds in directing the conversation away from territory she's not comfortable with. This forces the gallant to change tack, moving from flattery to invitations to dance and drink, and those prove poor Mary's undoing. At first glance, the position of Gawain in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is rather different to these two female characters. He's a man and he's subject to different kinds of social and sexual values. He's also a knight at King Arthur's court, so in terms of privileged status, Gawain is right at the top there. But during the third part of the poem, Gawain becomes vulnerable in a way which echoes the two cases I've just described. First, like the Digby Mary Magdalen, he is dislocated from his base of power. So where Mary moves from castle to tavern, and there she is vulnerable, Gawain is a guest at the home of a mysterious lord that we will later find out is called Bertilac. Here, Gawain finds himself subject to the hospitality, whims, and dubious sense of fun of his host. while ostensibly more a part of the aristocratic, courteous world of Camelot, this castle, like the Digby Tavern, seems to have a slightly different understanding of what courteous behaviour is, as well as games and rules, to the place that Gawain comes from. Second, like Dame Siriþ's Margery, Gawain finds his own courtesy gets himself into a situation which makes him spiritually and sexually vulnerable. Just as Margery courteously promises to grant whatever Willikin asks of her, so Gawain tells the Lord, I shall stay at your request, and in other matters do whatever you think fit. Unlike Willikin, Lord Bertilac uses Gawain's routine courtesy to orchestrate a situation in which Gawain is going to be tested throughout the next 1,000 or so lines. He later reminds himself of this promise. You have agreed to do whatever deed I bid. Will you hold true to this here and now? Ye han determined to do the deed that I bidde. Will ye helder this here and this one? He uses this to orchestrate a complicated situation in which the Lord goes out hunting with all the men for the day, while Gawain remains alone resting in bed in the castle. The Lord also suggests that the two of them play a game in which the two men will exchange anything they gain during the day. Given Gawain has already promised to do what the Lord requests, he can only really agree to this game. All of this means Gawain is in a vulnerable position when on the morning, the Lord and his men go out hunting, and he's dozing in bed when the lady of the household enters. The lady conducts 2 invasions of Gawain's personal space, first on entering his room, and then in creeping inside the bed curtains and sitting on bed waiting for Gawain to wake up. And we've got an image of this here. There are only 2 illustrations in the Gawain manuscript, and the first one is the beginning of the poem where a Green Knight rocks up in King Arthur's court and starts a fun game of beheading. And the second one is this one, which shows how important the illustrator felt this moment to be. Andreas H. Jucker has stressed the vulnerability of this scene, in which Gawain is far from both the armour he would normally use when facing a test or adversary, and also from the proper attire of courtly dress in which he would converse with a lady. And here he says, the lady approaches him when he's in a vulnerable position. He's still in bed, presumably undressed under the covers, and therefore unable to get up and address her in an appropriate posture. Given the lady's presence in his room and bed is already breaking several key rules of courtly behaviour, Gawain, bless him, doesn't know what to do. His first rather comic strategy is to pretend to still be asleep to give himself some thinking space. She remains in the room. Eventually he resolves, more seemly it were to aspire with my spell in space what she would. It were more seemly to find out with my speech what she wants in this space. Here, Gawain realises that feigning sleep, ignore the problem and it might go away, is not a strategy that works. But crucially, the next strategy he turns to is his speller speech, which he sees as a mechanism for defence. What follows is a negotiation of polite behaviour, which takes a similar form to the 2 episodes I've just analysed. After a very awkward moment in which Gawain is obliged to fake waking up, like Dame Margery, he attempts to change their physical relationship within the space of the bedchamber. He asked the lady, then grant me leave, I would boy of this bed and buff me better. You should care for more comfort to carp you with. Then grant me leave, I would like to leave this bed and dress myself better. I should have all the more pleasure in talking with you. While Margery used a chair to direct her lover's movement within their space, here Gawain attempts to politely express his wish to be physically distanced from the lady until properly attired, as a means of allowing him to entertain her better. This also sets a courtly expectation on their interaction. Without directly accusing her of inappropriate behaviour, and her behaviour is extremely inappropriate, he outlines how he is planning to change his behaviour and clothing to make their conversation acceptable, thus saving her the embarrassment of being accused. The lady isn't having any of this, however. She says she will tuck you in on the other side and converse with the knights whom I have caught. The rest of their dialogue is also presented as a contest of attack and parry. And the poet notes that she made him so great a cheer and was so fair at face that the knights with speeches skillful had to answer each a case. Harvey de Rue has claimed that Gawain uses love talk as a method of safeguarding himself. He avoids trouble by adopting the language of humility of courtly love, denying the lady's evaluations, which would logically give him the initiative. So even though in courtly love, it's almost always the man who has control of that situation, even when he's expressing servitude. Here, you've got that situation reversed, and he's adopting that language as a way of trying to get back some of that power. But unlike the two women I've discussed, this strategy doesn't really work for Gawain. Through repeatedly and awkwardly praising Gawain's person, but especially his reputation for courtesy and honour, the lady makes it really difficult to break with what she is defining as the rules of politeness. As we've seen, Margery and Mary reached their limit in terms of tolerating inappropriate behaviour in their texts. Gawain, however, never directly calls the lady out on her behaviour. Willikin and the tavern gallant clearly cross a line in making their sexual proposals very clear to their would-be lovers. Lady Bertilac, however, knows how to manipulate politeness as a weapon of attack as well as defence. This means that where Margery and Mary could correctly identify and call out inappropriate behaviour without losing their own courtesy, Gawain is stuck with hinting that, no, I really would be better equipped to receive you if I was wearing the right stuff. The closest he comes to reminding her that her behaviour is not appropriate comes when she claims that, given wealth and free choice, she would choose him as her husband. Gawain responds in a way which both flatters her and reminds her and himself of the duty that they both owe to her husband. He says, "Indeed, you have chosen far better." Unlike Margery and Mary, however, Gawain doesn't have the same confidence in his own impeccable behaviour. This entire section of the poem is riddled with his self-doubt about how well he's pulling off this performance. He remains really insecure about this, and when she expresses doubts that he is really Gawain, he immediately worries, lest he had failed in form of his casts, that there'd been a fault in the way he'd spoken. It is this doubt that the lady exploits in coercing a kiss from Gawain, all the while defining this kiss as courteous behaviour worthy of his reputation. And here she says, so well as Gawain is rightly held, and courtesy is enclosed so cleanly in himself, could not have lightly stayed so long with a lady, but he had craved a kiss by his courtesy. While the direct expression of sexual desire was the breaking point in the other two texts, here the lady defines courtesy as an action which might be deemed sexual. This leaves Gawain with no defence. Conor McCarthy notes that while Gawain does kiss on command, he also attempts to control the meaning of the kiss. So he grants the kiss, but sort of where she's asking for an amorous kiss, he grants a polite kiss. But because the ladies assume the role of defining what is courteous behaviour, it's really difficult for Gawain to contradict her, especially as that same courtly code makes contradicting and calling out an aristocratic woman very difficult. This is the first of 3 episodes in this poem in which there's a contest between courtly and polite language. That each encounter between the Gawain and the lady is increasingly figured as a battle or test is emphasised by the poem in the following scenes. And here's just one example of them, but it's riddled throughout this part of the poem. The noble lady tested and tempted him often, for to win him to grief, whatever else she may have thought. But he defended himself so fairly that no fault was apparent, nor no evil on either side, nothing but happiness. It's really interesting, isn't it, that evil on either side. So he's not only trying to protect his own body integrity, reputation, but also his courtesy relies on no fault being found in her behaviour either, which is not something Mary or Margery in the other texts had to deal with. The imagery of entrapment and battle established by the lady in the first bedroom scene is emphasised here, and she visits his bedchamber twice more as well. But the onus is on Gawain to defend himself so fairly that no fault appears in either of their behaviour. While the poet also stresses that the pleasure that both take in this kind of witty, evasive love language, it's also very clear that the dialogue causes anxiety and strain for Gawain. Just before he accepts and then conceals the lace that she offers him, and this is something he comes to see as his single major fault in the poem. The poet shows Gawain is under huge pressure to maintain his courteous language. And here again, we get this scene of entrapment. For that princess of price pressed him so thickly, urged him so near the limit that he must needs either accept her love or rudely refuse it. He cared for his courtesy lest he should behave cravenly, and even more for his plight if he should commit a sin. Don't forget, of course, that he's agreed with the Lord that whatever they gain during the day, they're going to swap at the end of the day. And the Lord has been out hunting and exchanged each time for kisses. But this means if Gawain goes even further with the wife, he's going to have to do the same with the husband. So there's all sorts of pressure in this scene. And there's a sense that kind of there are two coercions going on here. However, in this passage, what's most interesting is that Gawain's worry is that not that he can't resist her sexual advances, but rather that he's going to have to be discourteous and refuse it. Where the merchant class Margery recognised that actually there are situations in which it's acceptable for politeness to end, Gawain finds that politeness turned against him, and he finds its limits as a defence. You can't call out rude behaviour as easily if your opponent gets to define what politeness is. Gawain, Mary and Margery all use politeness to manage situations in which they are not comfortable. When politeness itself is not enough, the two women switch to the more risky strategies, calling out bad behaviour for the uncivil harassment it is, whilst using their own behaviour as a model for emulation. But as Gawain finds, there is a limit to what politeness can do. Despite her spirited retorts, Mary Magdalen admits love for the gallants by the scene's end, although there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest this only happens because she gets really drunk in that scene. She is encouraged to drink both before and during the gallant's entrance, and her possible drunkenness is clear when the language register changes to the florid, over-the-top courtly register of the gallant himself. Even at your will, dear darling, though you will go to the world's end, I will never travel away from you to die for your sake. This abrupt change suggests not that Mary's been seduced by the words of this unappealing character, but more that the drinks made her less able to speak to resist his advantages with her earlier directness. She's not in command of her full, her full ability consent in this play. Where in Dame Siriþ, Dame Margery is a well-off woman in command of her own space, Mary is dislocated from her castle, and her aristocratic courtesy has less defensive power in a tavern. This is also Gawain's problem. As the guest at another man's court, he is obliged to play by the rules of his host, and the polite structures which would normally protect his courtesy in Camelot are less effective. However, all three characters find politeness alone is not a fail-safe means of getting rid of a harasser. Although Margery ends her conversation with Willikin, the old woman and trickster Dame Siriþ exploits this very courtesy that Margery had called to her defence. Dame Siriþ manipulates Margery's generosity by acting as a beggar. Once she's gained Margery's charity, she tells her the lie about her daughter having been turned into a dog by a spurned clerk. One reason that this succeeds is that Margery is using courtesy as a generous rather than defensive mechanism, and she doesn't see Dame Siriþ, a woman, as a threat. Where courtesy and professions of generosity helped her control and manage Willikin's behaviour, these same actions backfire with Dame Siriþ. Instead, it forms an unwanted bond of trust with a trickster, which Siriþ uses to direct the narrative towards a very unchivalrous conclusion. I'd love to think a little bit more one day about why Margery and Mary are more susceptible to female than male characters, but in both texts they're better equipped to mistrust and resist the words of men. As well as stressing the importance of courtesy in answering street suitors, How the Good Woman Taught Her Daughter, that piece of contact literature I mentioned earlier, also talks about the importance of fair words in preventing marital conflict. Fair words slay wrath, fair words wrath shall never make, nor fair words never broke bone, nor never shall in no way. This passage supports the fiction that fair words work as a defence against men's wrath and physical violence. Fair words broke never a bone. This poem places a heavy burden on women's behaviour, making them responsible for how men behave by employing male anger and violence is due to their failure to perform fair words. Even today, A victim's defensive politeness is persistently misread, even used as a defense by harassers. If you weren't interested, why did you encourage me? Margery and Mary's politeness has been similarly downplayed in criticism of these texts, particularly when the scenes are primarily interpreted as comic or parodies. Moreover, the fact both end up capitulating to their harassers has produced a tendency to read their early resistance as not genuine. Nor does Gawain escape, he's an idealized man, but he doesn't escape these entrenched misogynist assumptions. While the poem does present Lady Bertilac as a threat, a lot of later academic criticism of this poem has so often started from the foundational assumption that because this lady is particularly described as being beautiful, Gawain is tempted by her. I hope this paper has helped refute some of these ideas by showing that the fact that Mary, Margery and Gawain are eventually coerced doesn't diminish the importance of their resistance. And particularly, I want to advocate for the understanding of defensive politeness as an expression of agency, resilience, and resistance. Thank you.
A huge thank you for taking part this evening. It is part of our public lecture series from the University Centre Telford, and we do this as part of our regional learning centres. And I can bring Shirley back in here because Shirley will tell us what else is going on from Telford. But a huge thank you for taking part tonight. It's been enlightening. And I'm sure Shirley in due course will be able to have this available on the website for other people to either listen again, view again, or even share with their colleagues and friends as well.
Yeah, that's right. This recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, so you can watch back, or if you really enjoyed it, want to share with families and friends, then you can. So it should be on our YouTube channel in the next few weeks, I hope. So the next popular lecture of this series from the School of Humanities is on the 14th of July by Dr. Marianne West. You should or you must self-isolate COVID-19 and modality. So you can book this via the Eventbrite from this week. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you, Daisy, for delivering an amazing lecture.
So a huge thank you to everybody for taking part tonight. Loads of messages coming in saying thank you, how much they've enjoyed the lecture this evening. Daisy Black, Dr. Daisy Black from the University of Wolverhampton, a huge thank you once again, and thank you to the University Centre Telford, particularly Shirley and Paula and the team there for supporting this event this evening. Good night, everyone.